Gulf Haven, Florida. 3 days after the funeral. A daughter is watching her history disappear. The humidity clings to my skin like a second layer of grief, but inside the house the air is freezing cold. My name is Juliet Green, and I am standing in the kitchen where I was raised listening to my parents laugh. They are drinking wine over my grandmother's empty chair, confident that the missing will means they have finally won. They think they can erase me with a smile, erasing the years I spent caring for this land while they chased status. But they forgot one thing: the walls of this house have ears, and I am done listening. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The hallway outside courtroom 3B smelled like floor wax and old dust, the kind of sterile scent that chokes the air out of your lungs. I stood by the water fountain, clutching a manila folder so hard my knuckles had turned white. Across the corridor, my parents Victor and Denise Green looked like they were attending a garden party rather than a hearing to dismantle their daughter's life. They stood in a tight, confident circle with their high-priced lawyer and a few relatives who had flown in for moral support for them, not me. My mother smoothed the front of her silk blouse, laughing softly at something the lawyer whispered, while my father checked his watch with an air of bored impatience. They looked radiant, successful, and utterly untouchable. I looked down at my simple gray dress and scuffed work flats, feeling small. I wasn't just the defendant in their eyes. I was a mistake they were finally correcting. I watched them, realizing a cold, hard truth that made my stomach turn. By the time they tried to erase me on paper, they'd already been practicing for years. To understand why I was standing in that hallway shaking with a mixture of rage and grief, you have to understand where I actually came from. Technically, Victor and Denise were my parents, but they didn't raise me. The humid, salt-sprayed coast of Florida did. Specifically, a cluster of 7 modest beach cottages owned by my grandmother, May Carter. While my parents were off in Atlanta or Charlotte chasing promotions image and the next big status symbol, I was in Gulf Haven, scraping barnacles off pier posts and learning how to properly fold fitted sheets. Grandma May wasn't rich, but she was rich in the things that actually mattered: resilient service and personal responsibility. The cottages weren't fancy. They had screened-in porches that squeaked when you opened them, and window units that rattled in July, but they were a sanctuary. Grandma rented them cheap to people. The rest of the world overlooked Vietnam veterans living on fixed incomes, young teachers trying to save for a wedding, single moms who just needed a safe week near the ocean. I grew up changing their linens and listening to their stories. I learned that an honest day's work left a good kind of ache in your muscles, and that community wasn't about who had the most money, but who showed up when things went wrong. My parents, on the rare weekends they deigned to visit, saw things differently. To them, the cottages were an eyesore, a wasted asset rotting in the salt air. "You're sitting on a gold mine, Mom," my father would say, gesturing vaguely at the property, with a grimace, as if the very sight of the peeling paint offended him. "Bulldoze these shacks, put up luxury condos. You could be making 10 times the passive income." Grandma would just sip her iced tea and smile that tight, polite smile she saved for tourists and her son. "These shacks are homes, Victor, and I'm not interested in passive income. I'm interested in people." That wedge between them drove deep, and I was always on Grandma's side of it. It made me a target. As I got older and chose a career as an EMT instead of something lucrative in finance or law, the distance grew. They belittled my choices at every turn. They'd forget my birthday, or make backhanded comments at Christmas about how my cousin was making 6 figures in marketing while I was driving an ambulance. They treated my life like a temporary phase, something embarrassing I would eventually grow out of. But late at night, sitting on the porch with Grandma, while the cicadas screamed in the trees, I knew I was exactly where I belonged. "Don't let them get in your head, Juliet." Grandma told me one night, her hand frail but heavy on my arm. The air was thick with the smell of jasmine and impending rain. "They see the price tag. You see the value. One day these cottages will take care of you as long as you keep taking care of them." She never explicitly told me what was in her will, but the promise hung in the air like the humidity, heavy and undeniable. I anchored myself to that hope. I thought my devotion, the years I spent painting shutters and unplugging drains while my parents were absent, meant something. I was naive. The first real foreshadowing of their plan to erase me happened 2 years ago at a 4th of July barbecue. I was in the kitchen slicing watermelon when I heard their voices drifting through the open window. They were on the patio, unaware I was just a few feet away. "When Mom's gone, we'll finally modernize everything," my mother said, the ice clinking in her glass. "Clear the lot. It'll be a fresh start." "What about Juliet?" my father asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "She's attached to the place." "Oh, please," my mother scoffed, a sound that cut sharper than the knife in my hand. "Juliet needs a push to get a real life. Once the cottages are gone, she'll have to move on. She can keep doing her little job somewhere else. It's for her own good." I stood frozen over the sink juice dripping onto my fingers. They didn't just want the money. They wanted to scrub away the only identity I had ever claimed for myself. They spoke about my life as if it were a smudge on a window pane, something to be wiped clean, so they could have a better view. I didn't confront them then. I just swallowed the hurt, assuming I had time to prove them wrong, assuming Grandma would live forever. I was wrong. The ambush didn't start in a courtroom. It started on a Tuesday with a single midnight phone call that shattered the world. The call came at 2:14 a.m., a jagged, piercing sound that tore through the silence of my apartment. I fumbled for the phone, my heart already hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, knowing that calls at this hour never brought anything but ruin. It was Pastor Miller, his voice thick with a sorrow that confirmed my worst fears before he even finished the sentence. Grandma May was gone. "A massive stroke," he said. "It was quick. She didn't suffer." The words floated in the air, abstract and nonsensical, refusing to land. I was in my car 10 minutes later, tearing down the interstate toward the coast, screaming into the empty darkness until my throat tasted like copper. I arrived at the house just as the sun was bleeding a bruised purple light over the horizon. I expected silence. I expected to walk into the stillness of a life interrupted to find her half-finished crossword puzzle on the counter or her slippers by the chair. Instead, I found a command center. My parents' luxury SUV was already parked in the driveway, looming like a sleek black hearse. When I pushed open the front door, the scent of Grandma's lavender soap and old paper hit me, a sensory punch that brought tears instantly to my eyes. But it was overlaid with the smell of my father's expensive cologne. They were sitting at the kitchen table. My mother was already sorting through a stack of mail, and my father was on his phone, speaking in a low, authoritative tone. They didn't look like grieving children. They looked like auditors. When I walked in, my father glanced up, not ending his call, just giving me a curt nod. My mother sighed, putting down a utility bill. "You made it," she said, her tone implying that my arrival was a logistical hurdle rather than a family reunion. "We've already called the funeral home. It's handled." I wanted to help with that. I choked out, the grief finally catching in my throat. "It's better this way, Juliet," she replied, smoothing her hair. "You have your busy little life up in the city. We didn't want to burden you. We're taking charge." The next 3 days were a blur of numb formalities. I stood by the grave, watching the community Grandma loved pour out their hearts, while my parents accepted condolences with practiced grace, acting the part of the devoted family. But the real blow didn't land until the dirt was settled. 2 days after the funeral, they summoned me back to Grandma's kitchen table. "To go over details," my father said. I sat down, expecting us to discuss how to keep the cottages running, how to manage the tenants who were already panicking about their future. I was ready to collaborate. I was ready to step up. I walked into an ambush. "We need to be clear about the situation." My father began, clasping his hands on the table. He looked at me with a pitying expression that made my skin crawl. "We've turned the house upside down. We've checked the safe, the files, everything. There is no will." The room seemed to tilt. "That's impossible," I said. "She told me." Whatever she told you was just talk, Juliet. My mother interrupted, her voice sharp. Old people get confused. They say things they don't mean. Legally, she died intestate. That means everything, the house, the land, the cottages, automatically goes to her next of kin, to us. But she wanted me to manage the cottages, I insisted, my voice rising. She promised me. This is my home. Those people out there rely on me. My father let out a short, dismissive breath. You're not on anything, Juliet. Not the deed, not the accounts. You were never meant to manage all of this. It's a complex asset, not a hobby. Don't make this awkward. We're doing this for the family, my mother added, reaching out to touch my hand, a gesture that felt more like a restraint than comfort. We've sacrificed our own dreams for years worrying about her paying for things you didn't even know about. We deserve some freedom now. We're going to sell the parcels. It's the only logical move. You're erasing her legacy, I whispered, the realization crashing down on me. You're erasing everything she built. We're liquidating an asset, my father corrected coldly. And frankly, you should be grateful. You've sacrificed enough of your life sweeping porches and changing light bulbs. We're setting you free. Go live your life, Juliet. Let the adults handle the business. The condescension was a physical blow. They weren't just taking the property, they were rewriting history. In their version of the story, my devotion was a burden, my presence was negligible, and Grandma's wishes were non-existent. They were literally erasing me from the narrative, banking on the fact that without a piece of paper, I didn't exist. I stood up, shaking. I thought I had time, I said, my voice hollow. I thought I had time to prove to you that this mattered. It's over, Juliet, my mother said, turning back to her papers. Go home. I stumbled out the back door, needing air, needing to escape the suffocating weight of their triumph. As I reached the bottom of the porch steps, a shadow detached itself from the side of the house. It was Mr. Henderson, the elderly tenant from Cottage 4. He looked around nervously, then pressed a plain, sealed envelope into my hand. Your grandma knew this might happen, he whispered, his eyes darting toward the kitchen window where my parents sat. She told me to give this to you, if they ever tried to erase you. My hands trembled as I tore open the seal of the plain envelope Mr. Henderson had pressed into my palm. The paper inside was thin, likely torn from one of the yellow legal pads Grandma kept by the phone, and the handwriting was unmistakable, the looping, frantic script she used when she was in a hurry. It was short. If they try to cut you out, check the place where I locked my biggest secrets. You'll know it when you see it. Taped to the bottom of the note was a small, tarnished brass key with a number stamped on the head, 402. I didn't need to guess. I knew exactly where Grandma kept her secrets. It wasn't in the house. It was at the Gulf Haven Credit Union, a tiny brick building where the tellers still gave lollipops to grown men. The next morning, while my parents were busy meeting with a surveyor to appraise the land value, I slipped away. The air inside the bank vault was cool and smelled of copper pennies. When the clerk slid the long metal drawer out and left me alone in the privacy booth, I felt a heavy stone settle in my gut. Inside the box, there were no diamonds or stacks of cash. There were old ledgers recording decades of rent payments, photos of the cottages from the 70s, and a crisp document paperclipped to a blue folder. It was a draft of a last will and testament. My eyes scanned the pages, my breath hitching as I read the clauses. It wasn't signed, but the intent was screaming off the page. It explicitly named me, Juliet Green, as the primary steward and manager of the Carter cottages, with specific instructions that the land could not be sold for commercial development for at least 50 years. It was a draft. Legally, it was just a piece of paper, but emotionally, it was proof. Grandma hadn't forgotten me. She hadn't been confused. She had been planning this. I spent the afternoon driving through town, needing to cement the truth before I took it home. I stopped at the bakery, the hardware store, and the church. The reaction was the same everywhere. When I mentioned my parents taking over, the color drained from people's faces. But May told us, the hardware store owner said, leaning over the counter. She told everyone who would listen that you were taking the reins. She was terrified your folks would flip the place the second she was in the ground. Every conversation was a validation and a heartbreak. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining my place in this family. I had the community's truth, but my parents held the legal power. That night, the atmosphere at the dinner table was suffocating. My parents were in high spirits discussing potential listing prices for the waterfront lots. They were carving up Grandma's legacy like a roast chicken. I waited until my father poured himself a second glass of wine before I slid the copy of the unsigned draft onto the table. I found this, I said, my voice steady, despite the adrenaline flooding my veins. In her safety deposit box. She drafted a will, Dad. She named me manager. My mother didn't even flinch. She picked up the paper, glanced at it with a bored expression, and dropped it back onto the table. It's not signed, Juliet. It's a wish list, a scribble. It proves what she wanted. I pushed back, gripping the edge of the table. It proves she didn't want you to sell. She wanted me to protect the tenants. She changed her mind, my father said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its jovial edge. If she wanted this, she would have signed it. She knew you weren't capable of handling the financial burden, so she did the kind thing and left it to us. She didn't change her mind, I snapped. You know she didn't. Victor set his glass down. The sound of the crystal hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot. He leaned forward, and for the first time the mask of the grieving, benevolent father slipped completely. His eyes were cold, calculating. Let's be very careful here, Juliet. You really want to blow up this family over some rotting cottages. You want to drag us through the mud. I want you to do the right thing. The right thing, my mother interjected, her voice dripping with venom, is for you to stop acting like a spoiled child. You're becoming obsessive. It's concerning. In fact, if you keep pushing this hysterical narrative, we might have to have a talk with the rest of the family. Maybe even your employer. I'm sure the ambulance service wouldn't want someone who is mentally unstable responding to emergencies. The threat hung in the air, explicit and ugly. They weren't just threatening my inheritance. They were threatening my stability, my reputation, and my livelihood. They were willing to burn my life to the ground to protect their payday. I've sacrificed years to this place, I whispered, realizing the depth of their betrayal. To you. And you'd erase me with a single signature if you could. We already have, my father said softly. Don't make us erase the rest of you. I left the table and drove to the darkened cottages, sitting in the silence of Grandma's empty office. I was alone. I was outgunned. But I had the draft and I had the anger. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number of a local estate attorney the pastor had whispered to me earlier that day. A woman answered on the third ring. Rachel Hines. My name is Juliet Green, I said, staring at the unsigned will. My grandmother died last week. My parents say there was no will, but I found a draft and I think the real one didn't just get lost. There was a pause on the line, heavy with implication. If there really was a signed will that vanished after your grandmother died, Rachel said, her voice sharpening, then this isn't just cruelty, Ms. Green. It might be a crime. Rachel Hines' office was nothing like the polished mahogany-paneled firm my parents had retained. It was a cramped room above a dry cleaner on Main Street, smelling faintly of steam and starch. But Rachel herself was razor-sharp. She was a woman in her late 40s with eyes that missed nothing and a patience for nonsense that measured zero. She laid out the Florida statutes on intestacy and missing wills with brutal clarity. The law presumed that if a will was in the possession of the deceased and couldn't be found after death, the deceased had destroyed it with the intent to revoke. To overcome that presumption, we needed more than a draft. We needed proof of existence and proof of foul play. She leaned across her desk, her expression grave. I need you to understand what happens next, Juliet. If we file this petition, your parents aren't going to just be annoyed. They will come at you hard. They will attack your character, your history, and your relationships. They will try to break you before we ever see a judge. I know, I said, though my stomach churned at the thought. But if I don't do this, they erase her. and they erase me. The hunt for the missing will begin not in a courthouse but in the church foyer. It was the church ladies, the unofficial intelligence agency of Gulf Haven, who cracked the case, Mrs. Higgins mentioned over coffee that Grandma had been fretting about making it official just 2 weeks before she passed. She pointed me toward Harold Benton, a retired notary who lived 3 streets over from the cottages. I found Harold on his porch whittling a piece of driftwood. He remembered Grandma May vividly. When I asked if he had notarized anything for her recently, he nodded slowly. She came by about 10 days before she passed, had 2 neighbors with her, said she needed to make sure her girl that's you was protected. My heart hammered against my ribs. Mr. Benton, do you have a record of that? He went inside and returned with a bound notary logbook. He flipped the pages with arthritic fingers until he landed on the date. There it was in black ink, May Carter. Last will and testament. Time-stamped. Signed by Grandma, notarized by Harold, and witnessed by the 2 neighbors, Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Gable. It was the smoking gun. A will had existed, signed and sealed days before she died. Somebody had to physically take that document, I whispered, tracing the entry. It didn't just get lost. Someone walked into her house and made it disappear. Rachel moved fast. We secured affidavits from Harold and the 2 witnesses. The pastor provided a sealed letter Grandma had left with him, explicitly stating her intent for me to manage the estate. But as we built our fortress of evidence, the war at home escalated. My parents found out I had retained counsel. Small towns don't keep secrets, and the retaliation was swift and vicious. Victor cornered me outside the ambulance bay at work, his face a mask of controlled fury. You are betraying this family in a way that can never be fixed, he spat, ignoring the curious looks of my coworkers. We are trying to secure a future for everyone, and you're acting like a parasite. If you proceed with this, Juliet, you are cut off. You hear me? We will tell everyone, your aunts, your cousins, that you are trying to rob your grieving parents. I'm trying to stop a robbery, Dad. I said, my voice shaking but my feet planted. We're listing the properties tomorrow, he sneered. By the time you get a hearing, there won't be anything left to fight over. They ramped up the pressure. I started getting texts from extended family members asking why I was attacking my mother while she was mourning. The emotional toll was a physical weight, heavy and suffocating. Then came the professional cost. My supervisor called me into his office. There was a promotion to lead paramedic on the table, a role I had worked toward for 3 years. But it required focus, overtime, and a clear head. With the legal battle consuming my days and the stress eating my sleep, I knew I couldn't do both. Rachel warned me this fight could drag on for months. I sat in my car for an hour staring at the steering wheel. I had played by the rules my whole life. I had worked hard, kept my head down, and waited my turn. Now, I had to choose. I walked back inside and turned down the promotion, requesting a leave of absence instead. It felt like cutting off a limb. I was risking my career stability for a fight I might lose. But as I drove back to the coast, I realized something shifted in my chest. I had spent my life doing what they wanted, terrified of their judgment. This time the sacrifice was mine, but for the first time it was on my terms. The community caught me when I stumbled. I came home to find casserole dishes on my porch and notes of encouragement tucked into my mailbox. The tenants weren't just tenants. They were my army. They gave statements, they watched the property when I couldn't, and they let me know I wasn't the crazy, greedy daughter my parents were painting me to be. 2 weeks later, the mail carrier delivered a thick, formal envelope. I opened it with trembling hands. It was a notice of a hearing date. The court had granted an emergency injunction to halt any sales until the matter of the estate was resolved. I ran my thumb over the case caption, Estate of May Carter versus Victor and Denise Green. On that paper, my name finally appeared. Not as the girl they could erase, but as the one calling them into the light. The morning of the hearing, the sun rose over Gulf Haven with a brilliance that felt almost aggressive. I woke before the alarm, my body humming with a strange electric frequency that was half terror and half resolve. I didn't dress for a funeral, and I didn't dress for work. I put on a navy blazer over a plain white dress, simple, sharp, and unpretentious. It was armor. Before I left, I stood in the center of Grandma's kitchen, running my thumb over the rim of her favorite chipped coffee mug sitting on the counter. The house was silent, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see if I was strong enough to defend it. The county courthouse was a monolith of concrete and glass, the air inside refrigerated to a bone-deep chill. My footsteps echoed on the terrazzo floors, a lonely sound that seemed to amplify the distance between the life I had known and the battle I was walking into. I spotted them near the double doors of the courtroom. Victor and Denise were flanked by their legal team, looking impeccable and serene. My mother wore a cream-colored suit that screamed old money, and my father was laughing at something his attorney said, a confident booming sound that made my stomach twist. They looked like they had already won. They looked at me briefly with an expression of mild annoyance, as if I were a traffic ticket they had to contest. They walked in expecting another ambush, another easy victory over a daughter they deemed insignificant. They didn't realize that this time I was armed too. The proceedings began with the suffocating weight of their narrative. Their lawyer, a slick man with a practiced drawl, painted a picture of a benevolent couple burdened by an intestate estate and an estranged, confused daughter. He claimed there was never a will, that Grandma had died suddenly without a plan, and that my parents were simply stepping in to manage the assets for the good of the family. "Your Honor," he said, gesturing to my parents, "Mr. and Mrs. Green have been nothing but patient. Their daughter is grieving, and we believe she is imagining promises that were never made to cope with her loss. She is trying to take what her parents have sacrificed for." I sat stone still, my hands clasped so tight under the table that my nails dug into my palms. It was a masterpiece of fiction. Then it was our turn. Rachel Hines stood up, her movements calm and deliberate. She didn't offer a long, flowery opening. She simply approached the bench. "Your Honor, the defense claims there was no will. We are not here to argue that a document was lost. We are here to prove it was stolen." She submitted the packet. The air in the room seemed to suck out as the judge took the stack of documents. I watched his eyes scan the pages, the affidavits from the neighbors, the letter from the pastor, and then the heavy thud of the notary logbook landing on the bench. He flipped to the bookmarked page, reading the entry Harold Benton had sworn to May Carter. "Last will and testament. Date. Time." The judge paused. It was a long, excruciating silence. He looked at the log, then at the parents, then back at the log. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of genuine curiosity breaking his neutral mask. "Mr. Green," the judge said, his voice dropping to a conversational volume that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. "You filed for administration of this estate 48 hours after the decedent passed, claiming absolute certainty that no will existed. Yet here is a sworn record from a state-licensed notary that a will was signed 10 days prior. Can you explain that discrepancy?" My father stood up, his confidence wavering. We searched the house, Your Honor. We found nothing. If she signed something, she must have thrown it away." "You searched the house," the judge repeated, leaning forward. "Did you search it before or after you decided the property was a gold mine, as stated in the text messages submitted by the plaintiff?" My father's mouth opened and closed, no sound coming out. The story was cracking. "Ms. Green," the judge said, looking at me, "do you have anything to add?" I stood up. I didn't look at my notes. I looked at my parents. They didn't just ignore me. I said, my voice trembling at first, then steadying into a hard, clear tone. "They practiced for this. My entire life they belittled my connection to this place because it didn't make them money. When Grandma died, I was the one who knew which linens she wanted for the service. I was the one the tenants called. My parents didn't come to grieve. They came to liquidate. They ambushed me while I was still in shock. They told me I had sacrificed nothing, that my time caring for her meant nothing." I took a breath, the words tasting like iron. "They threatened to ruin my reputation and my career if I fought them. They told me to my face that I was a liability to be removed. They didn't just want the land, Your Honor. They wanted to erase me from the legacy I helped build. They thought if they destroyed the paper, they destroyed the truth, But I am the truth, and I am not going anywhere. The courtroom was silent. My mother was staring at her lap, her face pale. My father refused to meet my eyes. The judge cleared his throat. He looked down at his parents with a gaze that was cold and final. This court takes the destruction of testamentary documents very seriously. I am halting all sales and transfers of the Carter estate effective immediately. I am granting temporary managerial authority over all 7 properties to Ms. Juliet Green. He paused, gathering his papers. I am ordering this into mediation before we proceed to a full trial, and Mr. Green, if any evidence surfaces that confirms the physical destruction of that will, this will move from civil court to criminal court very quickly. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Your Honor, my father whispered. As the bailiff called, "All rise." I turned to leave. Victor glanced back at me. He looked smaller, older, and shaken to his core. For the first time in my life, my parents looked at me like someone they couldn't control. And standing there, clutching the folder that proved I existed, I had to decide what to do with that power. And that brings us to the close of Juliet's journey to save the cottages and herself. It serves as a heavy reminder that the hardest battles are often fought against the people who should be on our side. If you enjoyed this narration, please hit the like button and subscribe for more. Tell us what you would have done in Juliet's shoes. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.